Okay, so in this video, we're going to extend our understanding of this equation. NCO equals NX. Now remember, that's net capital outflow equals net trade. And what I've indicated is that in Australia's case, net capital outflow for most of the last 50 years, or the years since early 1970s, we've had a negative net capital outflow figure. So I've just made up a figure of minus 50 billion, just an illustrative figure. So if this figure is negative, what does that mean in terms of investment flows? I'll just give you a second to figure out in your own words what minus 50 billion means. And when I say what does it mean, I mean in terms of foreign investment flows. Okay, so if you want more time, hit the pause button. Here's the answer. What that figure of minus 50 billion means is that we have more inward foreign investment than outward foreign investment. And the difference is $50 billion. In other words, that figure of minus $50 billion in terms of net capital outflow means foreigners are investing $50 billion more in Australia through stock and bond markets primarily than we are investing in foreign countries. It's due to savings being less than total domestic borrowing in Australia to the tune of $50 billion. But that's how you think about that intuitively, that minus 50 billion net capital outflow. It means more foreign investment money is coming into the country than is leaving the country. By the country, I mean Australia, obviously. This one is a little bit easier, minus 50 billion. That just means imports are greater than exports. NX is net exports, that's X minus N. Okay, so what I'm going to do is down here, the bottom half of this slide, just give you a very, very simple example of one transaction or two related transactions which would make this equation hold. Okay, and I'm going to consider it from the perspective of the money that flows in and out of Australia. So the question is, why does this equation hold? Now, we're going to go into a full-blown explanation of why that equation holds in the next video or two, but I just want to sort of motivate the idea in a very gentle way in the bottom half of this slide. Okay, so the story is this. You're going on holiday to New Zealand, and you estimate that you'll spend the equivalent of 50,000 Australian dollars in New Zealand. Okay, so that is one heck of a holiday, but 50 grand's a lot. But anyway, it was a nice round number at the time I created the slide. So you're going to spend 50 grand in New Zealand. Okay, now from Australia's perspective, that is an imported good. You are importing that holiday in New Zealand. Even though you go there to consume it, it's an import because you are a foreigner buying. Again, that $50 billion is an import into Australia, even though you go there and consume that whole foreign holiday. The reason it's an import is because you are an Australian buying a foreign good. Doesn't matter where you consume it. So then what you're going to do in the Forex market, the foreign exchange market, which we'll learn more about later, you're going to exchange your 50,000 Australian dollars for $51,000 New Zealand. Okay. So you know you'll be spending the equivalent of $50,000. What you'll be spending is 51,000 New Zealand dollars. I'm just saying that that's the equivalent of 50,000 Australian dollars. So now you've got your 51,000 New Zealand, you go on holiday, you spend that. But in the Forex market, when you are exchanging your 50,000 Australian dollars that you want to spend and getting $51,000 return to you in the form of New Zealand dollars, what you're doing is you're a seller of $50,000 Australian in the Forex market. You're supplying or selling 50,000 Australian dollars into the Forex market. So if you're selling that $50,000 into the Forex market, there must be a buyer. And the buyer is going to be someone, possibly someone in New Zealand who has New Zealand dollars. They will buy those 50,000 Australian dollars for 51,000 New Zealand. Now let's ignore fees on that foreign exchange transaction. Worrying about things like that is completely irrelevant. Yes, they exist. Fees on foreign exchange transactions like that exist. And I know that the buy and sell rates in foreign exchange transactions are different. I've certainly transacted enough going on holiday over the years myself to know that. But acknowledging that is just going to complicate the numbers. It will make it more realistic, but it's just going to complicate the numbers and make it harder for people to understand. So why would I do it? So I'm ignoring differences in buy and sell rates for foreign currency. I'm ignoring fees that you get charged on foreign currency exchanges, simply for simplicity. So you're selling $50,000 and someone else is buying them using New Zealand dollars. So now then the question is, well, we know that you are importing a foreign holiday to the value of $50,000, but what is the buyer of the $50,000, perhaps a New Zealander? What are they going to do with the $50,000? Well, I know down here, they could purchase $50,000 of Commonwealth Bank of Australia shares on the Australian stock market, but really they could purchase anything Australian. So look what's happening here from one perspective. You are in effect taking 50,000 Australian dollars and spending that money overseas, or the equivalent of that money overseas. But in order to actually spend that money overseas, you need to exchange it for foreign currency first. And so the buyer of your $50,000, that is the person that will supply you with the $51,000 New Zealand currency, they will take that $50,000 Australian and purchase it off you, but then they'll use it to buy something Australian. So it's almost like the $50,000 leaves the country, goes into the Forex market, is bought by a foreigner, and then they spend that money in Australia. They send the money straight back. So your $50,000 is not leaving the country. It's just being acquired by a foreigner in this example, and that person will spend it on something within Australia. So that's just sort of something that will become relevant a little bit later. What we're doing is seeing how you could spend money overseas on holiday, and in a sense that money kind of leaves the country. But as soon as it hits the Forex market to get exchanged for foreign currency, that money will just come straight back in when the foreigner who buys your Australian dollars spends that money in Australia, which is the only place they can spend it. So your $50,000 never really leaves the country. It just changes hands. Now, in terms of this example showing that this equation holds, let's get back to that now. So what we've got here is you have purchased an import, and the foreigner, the New Zealander, has used that 50,000 Australian dollars that you exchange in the Forex market to purchase CBA shares. Now, in purchasing the holiday, you purchased an import. And so let's just imagine that these are the only transactions on a given day. What is this equation, NCO equal NX? What does that look like on that given day? Well, you've just imported $50,000 worth of New Zealand holiday. So NX, which is X minus M is going to be $50,000 now. M is imports. So X minus M is minus $50,000, which is what I've got down here. Okay, and what about the foreigner? Well, they take your $50,000 and they will use it to purchase Commonwealth Bank shares. That is foreign money. So the New Zealander is in effect sending their $51,000 New Zealand into Australia. Yes, it's getting changed for Australian dollars. So they're sending the equivalent of 51,000 New Zealand into the Australian stock market to buy CBA shares worth $50,000. So that is inward foreign investment. NCO is net outward foreign investment or net capital outflow. So if you've got $50,000 of foreign money coming into our stock market to buy Commonwealth Bank shares, that is inward foreign investment. So on that day, it'll make NCO equal minus $50,000 as well. And so that's how you get a very simple example showing why this equation holds. We had $50,000 flowing out, but that money, and you sent the money out through your holiday, but a foreigner acquired that $50,000 that you were spending effectively in New Zealand. They bought those Australian dollars off you, and they just reinvested that money, or not reinvested, but they invested that money in the stock market. So we have a trade deficit on that day. NX is minus $50,000. And we're in a situation where more foreign investment money came into Australia than left Australia, or no money left Australia, no investment money left Australia on this day. And so we've got net capital outflow being negative, meaning we actually had some net capital inflow. If NCO is negative to the tune of $50,000, so if NCO is a negative number, it means we've actually had net capital inflow. And we did, $50,000 going into our stock market. So in that sense, that equation holds. Another example, I could have started off on this particular day with 0 and 0. And then we could have assumed that the first transaction on this given day was you importing a holiday worth $50,000. So that means imports went up by $50,000. But instead, I could change the example so that the New Zealander now takes the $50,000 Australian that they've purchased using $51,000 of New Zealand currency. They take that 50,000, they buy that 50,000 off you and use it to purchase $50,000 worth of Australian wheat. Make up some commodity, wheat. In that case, you would have imported $50,000 worth of foreign goods, but the New Zealander purchased $50,000 worth of Australian exports. So then, in terms of this equation, exports would have gone up by 50, imports would have gone up by 50, NX would have remained 0, and NCO is 0 on this day because under this new scenario, there's no foreign investment flows, there's no foreign investment transactions that I just mentioned. There's just you buying a holiday and a foreigner buying wheat. So NCO doesn't change. So even if the foreigner, the New Zealander, purchases Australian wheat, we'll still get that equation holding because NX won't change. So that's the sense in which this equation always holds. Now, it is a little bit more complicated than that. And in the next video, I will sort of motivate this equation in a more dynamic sense. I'll kind of give you examples where we look at how through time, one of the sides of this equation changes and it then generates a response in the economy to restore that equation to equilibrium. Okay, so yeah, I've just given you a very static example, an example at one point in time. The next thing we have to do over the next couple of videos is start to learn how to think about this equation as the economy moves through time. So obviously, every quarter, every year, that equation is going to hold, but there's going to be continual disruptions to this equation. So for example, NCO, you may have an Australian company investing $10 billion overseas. That would increase the value of NCO and temporarily mean that that equation no longer holds. Well, then the question is, how do you restore this equation to balance? Or you could have BHP undertaking BHP exporting another $50 million worth of iron ore, which would increase the value of NX as exports increase. Then the question is, with that equation out of equilibrium, how is equilibrium restored? So that's the direction we are heading in. But just for now, you should have a slightly better understanding of why that equation holds. But the next couple of videos will really help you solidify your understanding of why that equation holds, because we'll look at that equation in a more dynamic context. And by dynamic, I mean we'll look at that equation over time, over sort of 1 or 2 or 3 years, and how things change and how that equation kind of self-equilibrates itself.